I don't think it's too extreme. I mean, because, we're not told, okay, it's okay to sin a little bit. We're told not to do this. So where do you draw the line?
I just
What's a
think
little bit.
Yeah, I think it's that problem between love the sinner, hate the sin kind of a thing. I struggle with how you're supposed to do that, because there's some people that are hard to love because of the way they live.
I heard an interpretation of love the other day, which I thought was quite good. I think we have an emotional desire to hang on and cherish that, for instance, the wife. But their interpretation was that simply is you want to see the other person do well. I think that's a good, not necessarily the answer, but I think it's there. I want my wife to do well. If she outdoes me, I'm just thrilled. And I think that's the Christian, in my mind, the Christian attitude, that we want everybody to do well. And everybody in this room is better than I am. And everyone believes that they are less than everyone in the room. So it makes sense to want everybody to do better. That's why we pray for people. That's why we pray for the president. That's why we may not care for him, but we pray for the president.
It's something you mentioned that, Vicki, because I was struck by something this week. Any of you watch American Ninja Warrior or know what I'm talking about?
We watched it.
Yeah, it's on NBC. I guess we picked it up 5 or 6 seasons ago. It's these obstacle courses, that people run. And part of the show is watching them run these obstacle courses and the whole process. They go through qualifying, eventually get to Vegas, where there's like 4 stages to this thing. And the ultimate prize for the winner is $1 million. And but all the way through, and one of the things they do really well in this show is they tell the backstories of some of these people. So this person, got into this because they were needing to do something physically after they were recovering from cancer, or there's often a story tied to each of the. Even if there's not one, NBC goes and sort of finds one because that helps sell the show to some degree. But one of the interesting things to watch, I don't know if Kathy struck by the same thing, but we had several of it on DVR to catch up on this week because of what's been going on with Kay. And so we were watching, this is the national part where they're all in Vegas. And then these start to get to be some ridiculously difficult things. I mean, I couldn't imagine getting through 1/3 of one of the preliminary courses, let alone doing some of the stuff they do in Vegas. But the interesting thing you'll see is these people often train together in various parts of the country. And so while one of the competitors that they're competing against is running the course, you will see somebody that, by the way, they're running next, who's out there that is cheering for them and I really don't think, Kathy may disagree, I really don't think that's for the camera. I think that is, I think
they're willing to wish for the best for their fellow competitors. I don't think they think of it necessarily as like my inability to get through that obstacle means I'm less. I think everybody really is, at least it seems that way. Maybe it's just we have the wool pulled over our eyes, but it does seem like they're all genuinely interested in the other people doing well.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm sorry.
And so the last thing that they do, there's 5 of them that made it to this last stage. They've never had that many make it to the last stage before. The most they've ever had is 2. And the last thing is actually pretty simple. It's a 70-foot rope climb.
It's not simple.
Compared to some of the other stuff.
It's a 75-foot rope climb
But for them,
for 30 seconds.
As they are, it's probably not that bad.
Well, compared to the
30 seconds though.
but compared to the swinging obstacles and the other stuff they do, this is relatively not simple. It's relatively straightforward. I'll put it that way.
It's straightforward.
It's straightforward. It's 75 feet.
75 foot.
I didn't hear the 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds.
if you have to do it within 30 seconds to win $1 million.
Right.
After that, they call the last ninja standing, if they're not the American Ninja Warrior, I mean, they made it to there, by the way, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 courses before that, a prelim, locally, a final, then 3 stages, and this is stage 4. So you got to do completed 5 things successfully before then. If you make it up in 30 seconds, that's how you win the $1 million. The consolation prize is $100,000 to whichever one of the finalists
Well, in 12 years, they've only had 2 people
win the $1 million, yeah. And they've had like 7 years where nobody even made it to that stage. And so then the last, whoever makes it the farthest wins $100,000. Well, when they have more than one climbing to do this, by the way, none of them did it in 30
None
seconds.
of them did it in 30 seconds this time.
But,
Even though they had 5.
But then it was the fastest one. The reason I bring this up is this is not just, well, it's a medal, it's a title. This is $1 million, $100,000 on the line. And when you still saw the same, not just wishing them well, but good luck the same way you do when, okay, now I'm ready to kill you out on the field kind of thing. But that really struck me this week, and where the juxtaposition was and where it comes back to this, without getting into the politics of it, this was a nasty week in American politics. And what struck me as being the strange balance there is American Ninja Warriors seem to have what I think of as being the better parts of America attached to it this week. And by the way, both parties this week, I'm not picking on one party versus the other. Both parties went there this week. The opposite of that, to what Mickey said, this idea about what does it mean to love somebody? It means to want the best for them. Now, having said that, I think many of our politicians want the best for our country. They just have different differing ideas about what that means and how it ought to be. But what bothered me this week, and I guess it got around to the fact that after we had watched the American Ninja Warrior final and then seeing what went on in our politics this week, it's like, I like that NBC show version of America, which is to some degree staged and contained and easy. The stake there is who's climbing a rope in Las Vegas, right? That's the difference here versus the things that we're doing with the country. But I like the way I see people interact there more often than I like the way I see people interact in certainly on TV, public figures. And then sometimes how I see people interact in my workplace and how I see people interact I hate to say this, in our churches. It's that danger of how we let the ideas of success in the world get into what it shouldn't be. When you said that, Mickey, that really resonated with me, this idea. What does it mean to show love? It's not to say I love you. It's when you're climbing a rope. If you climb it faster than me, you get $100,000 and I don't, and yet I'm still rooting for you to do the best you possibly can. That's different. And that comes from, and I guess the reason I bring that up as an example, first of all, it's relevant this week because we encountered it, is that comes from the fact that there's a relationship there. The one guy, his name is Flip Rodriguez, and look up his story, it's sort of an interesting story. He was sexually abused as a kid. And so he and this other guy in Florida are both in Florida, but they don't live close to it. So they're driving like 4 to 5 hours once a week to train together. They did that this past year. And so both of them made it near that phase. One of them got to the 3rd phase and one of them was in the final. And, as soon as the one guy did, the other guy's over there racing to give this guy a hug. And that looked real to me. I think it was real. And I began to wonder, how much of that do we actually even see in our own church? Or do we see when somebody fails, we talk about failing morally, failing spiritually, that we go and rally around them the same way that they were rallying around when somebody was failing physically, if that makes any sense. So, what is love? Mickey gave us one definition of that here. And, to Kathy's question of how do we love the world? Well, it doesn't mean we love the things of the world, but we love the people that are in the world, which I think is hard. And then verse 17 really struck me. And the world is passing away with all of its desires, but the person who does the will of God remains forever. Is the world permanent? Permanent. Do we really think of the world that was passing away? Is that how, he says it here, but do we really think of it that way?
Science tells us that's going to happen, but it's a lengthy period of time before that occurs.
I tend to think, as I do this personally, that we tend to make the world more permanent than it really is. It feels, we act like it's more permanent than it is compared to God. We struggle with this concept called forever, called eternity. I mean, it's easy. Okay, it's that plus the plus one. It's that, it's that plus. It's that plus. It's that plus. I really struggle with that going backwards eternity thing. That really messes with my head when the number line goes to the other
I
direction.
think we're really supposed to understand eternity while we're here because we're bound by time. That time thing, God not bound by time, us bound by time. I
That's beyond.
trust that there's an eternity backwards and there's an eternity future, but me being able to really truly wrap my head around it, I don't think I can while I'm here because Earth is so much bound by time. And
Depends on our perspective and our knowledge, because what we see is not what God sees, and what we know is not what He knows. Whereas we live 70, 80, 90 years. He's there forever.
Yeah.
Let me,
Truly forever.
let me hit you with a thought. This is something my wife said, you're becoming a real strange idiot, and that's true. When I was little, Houston Post had little cartoons about the future and that sort of thing. One of them was there's going to be a planet that would eventually find that the robots have taken over, that the mammals will not have you die away. That is current talk now, that eventually, and they're talking seriously, that robots could eventually start reproducing. And they have done that, I think, in Japan. And I got to thinking about that. Christ says we're going to live for eternity, whatever that means. But what eternity means that we will have the same body that he had, and he rose into heaven. He can walk through walls. So when the robots take over this planet, this is theoretical, obviously. We shift gears and we come into an evolution of the body of Christ.
I don't know how to address that, Mickey.
It's weird, isn't it?
Except to say that one of the two interesting things headlines that I read this week that were along those lines. Yeah, AI is a little bit, it's fascinating, but it's scary in terms of.
That's true. That's true.
But one of the interesting headlines this week actually was that for the first time in many, I think in almost forever, the average lifespan in the United States went down. I don't know if you saw that headline or not.
Yes.
We're like down by, we were from 78, 79 to 76 now. Now, part of that was the influence of COVID-related deaths factoring into the statistics. But there's not enough of that to be the full offset there. It's just the fact that, we eat like we do fast food, we don't exercise because of the technology that we have. We don't have to go and do the things that are there. So that was one of the things, talking about even our idea of time. It used to be, well, we're living longer, and that's the nature of Kathy's mom being, she's 87.
Right.
Medical technology means that she could live on in this state for lengthier period of time than would have been the case before. So that's part of what's changing there. But the other thing that really jumped out at me, there's a similar headline along the lines about, this concept of even space, the James Webb telescope. I don't know if you've seen any of the pictures from this thing. One of the headlines this week was that they're seeing stuff that's not what they expected to see. Because remember, when you look further into space, the concept is because of the speed of light and the time it takes for light, assuming light is constant. That's a whole other thing that scientists are even coming back around to think about again. But this idea that the further you look, you're not just looking further in distance, but you're looking back in time. And so this idea was you get this new telescope like the Hubble was 30 years ago, that this thing now has the ability in a different spectrum with different clarity to look even further, which means it's looking further back in time. And the headline I saw this week and clicked and read the article and then went down the internet rabbit hole of a couple of other related articles, because you can do that now, was that scientists were surprised suddenly to see there's like fully formed stars further out than we thought that there ought to be. And there's galaxies that are more, not just, in the formation stage, but look like they're fully formed. And so this whole idea was that scientists are going, well, now that we're seeing this, what we thought was reality, we have to rethink this reality, which is even back to that concept of what does it mean to have a beginning. And one of the things that really jumped out at me in one of the articles there was a scientist that's like, we're gonna have to rethink our thoughts about beginnings, was exactly what the guy said. And I couldn't help but be struck by, okay, this, things are lining up a little bit more with our understanding of Genesis, seen through the eyes of science than it may have been before or otherwise. But that, even our concept of time is being altered by what we see in the world. So if we're not supposed to love the world, how do we live it? If you look back historically, part of what the church tried to do at various points was just not. Was this idea that we would be segregated or separated from the world. That's the idea of a monastery, or the idea of a nunnery type of thing. This idea of part of the way that you keep yourself pure from what John's writing about here in the world is just you don't.
That's not what Jesus did. We have to, if we're his disciples, we have to kind of model our behavior after what we saw him do. He went through Samaria. He welcomed the children. He, did the things that weren't necessarily what we think of as being the way to.
He did stuff
Be
that was
proper.
inappropriate.
Proper.
Yeah.
Proper.
Well, in fact, it was that inappropriate behavior that got him, quote unquote, in trouble with the authorities and with the powers that would be, and that he was doing things that weren't thought of as being the right, weren't thought of as being the quote unquote godly things to do in the eyes of the religious people of the day. So yeah, our example is Christ and how he interacted with the world, and he interacted with it on a daily, regular, tangible way.
But he also did go to the gambling houses. He went to the synagogue and told the gamblers and what have you, were gambling, that I could get so much more money if I could trade this or that currency or livestock. He did participate in that. I got angry with him and went up a whip and drove him out.
Because that was the world invading into the sacred space.
That's correct.
And so he was on guard for the fact that distinguishing between the two there. It was just in the thing last night that was even referenced. Again, that's always, as somebody preached on maybe here in a couple of weeks, it's always pulled out of context. The Christ in the temple, cleansing the temple. He wasn't cleansing the market. He was cleansing the fact that the market had come into the temple, is what he was dealing with. Which is sort of what this is about, the world coming into the space that is supposed to be kept separate, kept holy, kept distinct, which is us.
Okay, so you have a librarian at West University, second floor of the library. And there is a transgender teaching children things that I consider immoral. I know that I cannot go up there and grab the person and throw them over the rails. That's my first instinct. But the reality is, I've got, in my mind, I need to do something.
So how do you engage that, right?
Exactly.
I think that's the hard question. Because if we don't engage it, then we are giving a level of assent to it, right? By ignoring it or by being passive about it. If we do engage it, and we engage it in a violent, I'm trying to find the right word here, but aggressive, more extreme's a better word, because that puts it on a spectrum, more extreme way. I think it's hard to see Christ into that. And again, our example becomes Christ. I think, which is thankfully, we do have these instances from the Gospels where we see Jesus interacting with his first century equivalent of that and doing it in a way that does not give assent to making the sin and the immorality okay, but recognizing how to do it in love, which is the hard part.
That's very hard.
And, for me, part of this is where I always come back to, and I don't do this very well. I don't do it as well as I'd like to do. Part of it comes back to communication. Could you have a conversation? If that person was willing to have a conversation with you, Mickey,
Generally, they're not. I attempted that.
which tends to be the problem so
Yeah.
often today.
Yeah.
But could you have a conversation? Would you have a conversation?
I have an atheist that I'm having a conversation with, but I began to realize he had so much hate that you really couldn't talk to him. It was just, and then let's back off, just leave him alone, stay away from him. And my concept was to go out and, chat with him, see if we could win him over to Christ, but you have, when these people are locked into that concept of hate and their ideology, it's like I'm locked into my ideology. It's difficult to communicate.
Yeah, the thing I'm thinking about is it's just, the other thing that popped into my head when you mentioned that was I have somebody that I went to high school with that I'm still connected with on Facebook and is not just gay, but very openly advocately gay. And
So my contention is so long as he's gay, I don't have a problem with that, so long as he doesn't try to convert small children into this realm.
yeah, and where I've struggled with even like, but I've also struggled with other things different than this in social media, is that 90% of the posts pick a topic, randomly pick a topic out of a hat.
Yeah.
And almost always his post will somehow attach that around what I'll just generally call an alternative lifestyle agenda or gay agenda. It's like there's no topic that can't be addressed in that context or where that's the optic that comes from. And okay, I get that's who you are. And I get that, even though we're in disagreement, that's what you are about. I can recognize that, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be that. The work, what makes
I
this,
got a new cat.
I got a new cat, He would, I guarantee you, Johnny would find a way to make, at some point, either because of what somebody would comment or his own comment, that was somehow tied to the other. Having said that, I know people of both parties, again, politically, they can't make a comment about anything without ultimately becoming political. And even if I agree with them, there comes a point when that loses its whatever. And then I look at a verse like this, how am I supposed to interact with the world? That's where the rubber meets the road for me.
The other thing is that I listened to a theologian one time. He says, you don't need to engage somebody like the atheist. If you're an idiot, I can't believe you. Don't do that. Ask them questions. For instance, the transgender at Rice University's library. Why are there 40% of the transgenders committing suicide? I think the why is a possible lead-in. You haven't assaulted him, you're trying to theoretically figure out what he's up to and doing and understanding it, right? So I think, and Christ did that. Who do you say that I am?
And he had lots of conversations, the conversation with the Samaritan woman at the wedding.
Exactly. It turned her around.
With Sanhedrin, Christ engaged in a lot of conversations.
Right now in the college and career, they've got 2 Mormon missionaries coming on a pretty regular basis, right? Zachary, how did Zachary find them or who found them?
I think
Ethan found them. And it's not that they, from what I understand, they're trying to convert them and they're trying to convert our kids, but there's a discussion going on. Zachary's not giving up.
Who is this?
In our college and career group at this church, they invited and got 2 Mormon missionaries coming on a pretty regular basis to even their, when y'all had burgers or something, didn't they?
I'm kind of hooked. And of course, one time I was thinking about becoming a Mormon. So I was looking at everything, Judaism, et cetera, Islam, when I was very young. But one of the books that I picked up was The Nation of Many Gods. And it goes back, it has step by step, this little boy has gone through and has literally done his homework. He's gone back in the records, court records and what have you of Joseph Smith and his family and what they were doing in that time period. And it's shocking.
Well,
This guy-
Zachary's done a lot of research. Zachary's very fascinated by the Mormons, which I think is, I don't know, ironic maybe, because Jeff Potter was too. Jeff used to have to go to Utah a lot for work,
Mhm.
and he always found time to go to Temple Square when he was in Salt Lake to talk with Mormon. Jeff had his Book of Mormon, and Zachary's even asked me, "Do you know Dad's Book of Mormon?" No, I can't. But Jeff studied Mormonism, and he would talk to them because he knew what theirs said, he knew what ours said, and that's what Zachary's trying to do. So
You just have to be so careful about the wording, because I have a couple of coworkers that are Mormon. And they'll say things and you're like, oh, that sounds exactly like what.
Yeah.
I had a boss 30 years ago who was Mormon. This is where we would have conversations on the way out to meetings, and the realization, you think you're talking about the same thing until you further define it along. And I found, by the way, I have tons of resources if you guys,
you might let him know that.
I even have a spare Book of Mormon laying around the house if you really want to see.
And if
So
he
you
has it,
first
I'll
family.
let-
What's that book that you said where they investigated?
I'll get the book and I'll see if I can get you a copy or two.
But we
You
really
and
need to
anybody
pray
else.
for our college and career group, because this is an opportunity for them to minister to.
But here's the thing to understand, and I think that's a good example, again, tying back to the scripture here, is that part of the, by the way, the number one Protestant denomination that converts from what they are
Right.
to
Two
Mormonism
Mormon is bad.
are Baptists.
Yeah.
Well, I can understand that fundamentalism.
But they get-
What concerns me is the Mormons have a reputation for being, if I can use the term, holier. I think
They
the
are
average-
bullied.
the I think the
Are
average
looked
Baptist
to be.
is,
holier.
we can find him at the local saloon, that sort of thing.
Well,
And he's not trying to convert the.
and I think that's what's so attractive
Yes.
about, is that
Yes.
there are a lot of Christians who look and go, particularly socially/morally, they see an alignment with, without knowing about the celestial sex and having your own planet and all the other things that go with
Private underwear.
the theology of the deep theology of Mormonism. But the surface level daily interaction, the world interaction of Mormonism is incredibly attractive because of what is, by the way, the missionary aspect of Mormonism.
They're fantastic.
Just thinking about the fact, why are these people here? Because every Mormon is expected to go out and fulfill their 2-year mission in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And that means going out and being in the world. In fact, if you know anything about that, and I've read enough about it and read interviews for folks who've left that and outside of that, firsthand knowledge of it. The fact that they're able to come, I guarantee you their local elder, the local leader knows they're here because they view this as being an opportunity for conversion, because otherwise they wouldn't just let them go off and be in an environment unless they knew what was going on, because it's very strictly controlled and regulated.
Whereas our missionaries are going into the 1040 area, they know where they're going after Islam. But the Mormons have made an agreement with the Muslims that we won't invade your territory if you don't invade ours. That was some time ago. Now, that may no longer be the case, but I know many years ago that was the case. So they have limited it to the Southern Baptist.
And again, how it ties back to the verses that we're talking about here is this idea of what does it mean to, they have separated themselves from the world at the same time by going into the world. There's things that we could learn from the LDS church in terms of being zealous for being on mission, not being missions in, and certainly where I stand, not in Suriname or in Spain, but missions locally in the sense, of where you are, because again, those missionaries are coming, those Mormon missionaries are coming to the Bible Belt to whatever extent there still exists a quote unquote, Bible Belt. But yeah, I've got some really good
Well, there's
resources.
gonna
there.
be so many people too in the Bible Belt who have no concept of the Bible.
It's true.
I mean, I remember this was at least 20 years ago, maybe even more than that. And working for a program at First Baptist on a Wednesday night for the kids as we got close to Christmas and like our, like Awanas does the happy birthday Jesus thing. Yeah, and like we went to go get a happy birthday Jesus cake and like the person at the bakery not even knowing who Jesus was, which was great. We got the opportunity to share who Jesus was, why we were celebrating for the kids a birthday. But that kind of like hear my local community and somebody who had no concept of who Jesus was, that struck me, as a young adult with a young daughter. I was like, oh my gosh. I thought everybody knew.
It hurt me. I mean, you see baby Jesus in Walmart,
Which is, we won't get there today, but when we pick up, next week, when we get further, John will then talk about the false teachers and the Antichrist, how they will, it's because what's crept in is this lack of a true understanding about who Jesus is. And by the way, that's a first century. Again, who missed him? The people that should have known what they were looking for missed him. So it's easy for us to go, well, we didn't miss him. There, but for the grace of God, go I. In the sense of, what were you? Did they understand what they were looking for? Is the problem of first century.
The knowledgeable teacher he was, and it took that special revelation to.
The amazing thing I think that must have gone on in Paul's head, and I think about Paul often in that sense, is when he got it, I'm sure it was like that moment of, wanting to knock himself on the head going, how did I overlook this? How did I miss this? Because he had that knowledge. He was just missing that key. As you said, the personal encounter part was what he was missing. And once he got it, it's like, oh, of course. Now I can give you 35,000 verses from the Old Testament that will justify this.
Was that problem hate? Because I think it blinds a lot of people, it blinds me.
I think that there was, I think that's a great question, Mickey, because it's to what extent do we do that
Because he was
today?
killing people.
Yeah, he
He
was,
would take joy in it, that he was doing things right.
because the term that we use there is, when it's righteous,
Right.
is we call it zealous. It's zeal, right?
Mhm.
Zeal and hate from the outside look,
Yep,
it'd be really hard to distinguish between the two.
yep,
Look at the crusade.
exactly. Hope had a problem with not killing each other in Europe, and he had to send them someplace else so he could keep the cities halfway decent. I think that's pretty much what he did.
So, this idea of what we can now circles back full around the thing we started with, which was love. What does love look like? Well, love doesn't look like marching 2,000 miles away from your home to go and kill people because you're fighting over a piece of, maybe a valuable piece of dirt, the Holy Land, an important, significant piece of dirt, but over who occupies this thing. Or, does love look like, you've heard me, most of you have heard me tell this story hundreds of times. When I discovered this was in the early 90s, the building I was working in had an abortion clinic, and walked from the garage through an abortion protest to get into the building, and seeing people that were holding scripture on signs, but just going, I cannot imagine Jesus out here screaming and yelling, murder at this person who's going in. That does not lessen my feeling about that, but how would Jesus have engaged this? I'm pretty sure it's not that way. Would he have ignored it? No, that's the other part of the equation is, he would not have ignored it, he would have engaged it, but how would Jesus have engaged it? Well, if I'm engaging it as his representative in this world, I need to draw upon his example of how to engage. And to me, the scarier thing, again, not to keep going back to politics, but it's the thing right now that really messes with my head, to be very honest, is particularly when an election year.
You got to be extremely careful.
Yeah,
extremely careful.
I find it very difficult, even with other believers at times, to have conversations about these topics.
Yeah, we had that issue on the cruise and I made just a little comment and my brother-in-law just went off, and I was like, you know, it's like
And
an unexpected reaction.
I think so much for me is like, sometimes people will say something and I'll just be like, where did you research and get that information? Did you come up with that all in your head? Or did you actually go to some source and read the information and that's what you surmised from it? Because even my uncle came to visit my mom yesterday. And because she's not been at the facility for a full 2 weeks, she's still in isolation. And they have had a couple of positive COVID cases at all the facilities that we have looked at. There have been positive COVIDs. So we have to go in, put on an N95. When we go into a room, we have to put on a gown and things like that. My uncle came down from Dallas to see mom. And he gets in the room and immediately takes the N95 off and starts telling me about how N95s don't work anyway. If you actually wore an N95 and it fit you correctly, you would suffocate because no air would be able to get in. And I was like, I wear an N95 every day I'm at work. Where is that information coming from? Where is that information coming from?
The key thing there is he has doctor in front of his name. He's a dentist. He's a
Well,
retired
and his
dentist,
son is a doctor, and I'm sure he and Matt have had discussions. But I mean, he's saying this to somebody he knows is also medically trained. And I'm looking at him like,
You don't go to
where
the,
did you get this information?
if you go to the medical center, you see personal just dropping on the streets. Where
95 were around before COVID.
Long before COVID.
Unfortunately, I was like your uncle. I went to my son-in-law, the doctor.
Oh, I was gonna say,
And
yeah.
I said, I'm
That's
concerned
been-
about the children wearing those masks. I think they're gonna suffocate. I think they said, Mickey. Yes, I wear one every day. Most of my adult life. So I walk around.
But I mean, my uncle, his son is a doctor, and Jody has been much on the side of, we wear the masks, we protect ourselves, all of that stuff. He's argued, I've seen him do that on Facebook regarding where are you getting your information, kind of a thing. And I remember all the way back years and years ago, and I was trying to study the book of Daniel, and Don would be like, where did you get that information? And I was like, well, I read it, from this article. And he was like, who wrote that article? And I was like, I don't know. And he's like, well, it makes a big difference who writes the article, because you can find some really bizarre stuff based on prophecy, depending on the slant of the person who's writing it. So I don't know how to weed out the stuff that's not legitimate. Somebody could, and Don even said, because of his study of statistics and stuff like that, and he was like, you can make numbers,
You can make them look
Me-
any way you want.
anything you want them to mean. And
particularly survey data, because one of the things I took multiple classes in college that was sort of the area that I
You just
focused in.
manipulate it.
The way you ask the question, the way you sequence the questions, the options that you provide. You tell me what you want that survey to say. You tell me what you want the results to be. Not as good as I could have 30 years ago. I can write you the survey that will produce those results, or at least I know the concept behind that. And the people that do it every day, that is their job, know how to do it in order of magnitude better than I do in terms of being able to do it. And, you know, again, tying it back to the scripture here, when John's talking about truth, remember the audience that he's writing to, they had scripture to a degree. We already mentioned this, I think, a couple weeks ago. They had Paul's letters. They had the gospels in a form that had been distributed, but their knowledge and understanding of truth and where they could go to get truth was multiple orders of magnitude more limited in terms of what we have access to, which in some ways was the good news, because you couldn't stumble into,
Yeah, you couldn't Google it.
you know,
Flat 17,000 articles on it.
here's 5 million Google matches on flat Earth. Literally, they're talking about a flat Earth. The Flat Earth Society still exists. There are still adherents to it out there, believe it or not. But the flip side of that was, you know, what he's talking about here is, how do you know truth? You know, truth are residing in the light. And it was incumbent upon other believers to make sure that that light was properly delivered. You know, the gospel, you know, Paul says in one of you, I'm delivering the gospel as it was delivered to me. Then he goes on to do that summation of the gospel that exists there, which is pretty short. It's, you know, 7 or 8 verses. It was, you know, this happened, he appeared to this many, he resurrected. That's the essence of the gospel. We have so much more that's available to us, which is the good news. We have so much more that's out there that we have to encounter, which is the bad news. And the world has a lot of wacky things. You know, to your point, Nikki, this idea of, you know, asking a 12-year-old, what gender do you identify with?
Yeah.
Just blows my mind. It literally just, you know, blows my mind. And you know, well,
Not even a 12-year-old, a 4-year-old.
yeah, and you know, and there's there will be a doctor, there will be somebody who has quote unquote credentials who's able to, who is speaking to this. You know, I watched a thing on QAnon this week for about an hour.
I tried, but when I realized who that main guy, was it Tennessee?
I don't know which one. So I saw the thing I saw was on Vice this week, where I picked up like the 2nd season. And I'm just like, you know, the scary part about that thing again, so much of this happened, by the way, at these conferences were at churches, mega churches like in Arizona being a good example.
When we were watching, it was the pastor who's in Tennessee, that had the big tent and thousands of people were coming. He's a big that COVID was a
Bill Gates
conspiracy, you know.
I just, you
I
know,
turned it off. That's all I could watch.
the sad part for me, and I've covered your prayers for this, because I've reached the point now, I'm an agree in this. I used to enjoy studying this, paying attention to it. And now I just get disgusted.
You can turn them on.
Huh?
It grieves you.
Part of it is because I know something about it is part of the reason that it grieves
You
me.
need to turn them on. There's no gray area. This is right and this is wrong. This is great.
Which is why I never liked that. They
That's
wanted,
why you need.
they wanted one right answer, which is what I never liked about it. But
Not subjective.
no.
But it's not all finite either, it's imaginary.
As a good friend of mine I went to high school with, when they started mixing in the letters with the numbers, that's when I started having a problem. Yeah.
That's good.
That's fun.
Some friend knows.
Got the book ordered, and it's coming to you. I may not be able to get it to you next Sunday, but it's coming.
But you know
What book?
It's History on the Mormons.
Okay.
But one of the interesting things, you know, about that is that we've talked about this so many times before, even in equipping our kids to interact. You know, they go off to college, they even in before college now, in other settings that they're placed in. Again, are they relying upon their own faith and their own knowledge and understanding, or is it mom and dad's, you know, faith and knowledge and understanding? And for example, it wasn't until I was an adult, man, I knew generally about Mormons. What I knew about Mormons, I think before I worked for Bob Henry, was I knew that historically they had gone to Utah. I didn't know anything about the backstory about what happened in Illinois or upstate New York or the other things that, you know, led before that. I knew that, you know, I'd seen Paint Your Wagon probably. So I knew that they could have, I knew about the concept of polygamy
Mhm.
as expressed through a Hollywood musical in the 1950s, maybe.
Right.
But it was only, I guess what I knew was in the late 70s, we had the Godmakers documentary was shown at our church, so I had that background there. That was after we had been to, or about the same time we went to on vacation, and we went to Salt Lake City and toured the temple there, and that was the first time I ever saw, the concept of baptism for the dead. What is this about? Kind of thing, or the fact that, big DNA data ancestry. Who are they backed by? They're backed by the Mormon
That's
Church.
why I have a hard time. People, I'm gonna do ancestry.com. That's the Mormon Church. I mean, you're paying money to the Mormon Church if you use that. So I don't.
But they just want the data so they can baptize by proxy your great grandparents. That's the only reason they want the data. But again, back the world and truth, first century problem, 21st century problem. The scripture is just as valid, which is why we need to be further grounded and well grounded in what we know we believe and why we know what we believe. There's plenty out there.
And with that thought, when I went through quote unquote my Mormon phase, I went to a number of Baptist ministers. I said, what's the difference between the Mormons and Christianity? They had no idea. That's when I started doing my homework.
Well, and even more pointed there is the fact that, again, so much of what the advertisements on TV, when the Mormon Church used to be an advertising bookstore, like they were, if you remember that.
Mhm.
Very compelling.
Oh,
There's a lot of things about family and social fabric
Oh,
that
yeah.
are very attractive about it.
And it still is.
It still is. Which doesn't make that aspect wrong. It's just that's the veneer that's over
Mhm.
incredibly wrong theology. By the way, the same theological wrong that exists there, which point to other things, the theological problem with Mormonism is it's exactly the same point that Satan.
That's right.
You can be God. You can be God.
The original sin.
It's expressed in a different way, but it's the exact same theological problem construct is you can be God. There's some, there's science fiction elements to it, essentially, is what it boils down to, but it's no different. Satan doesn't have a very creative playbook. He's just really good at disguising the coverages in terms of what he does.
I mean, that's a good point.
Using football analogy.
Exactly.
It's still running the ball and throwing the ball. It's just,
Golden path, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah, he doesn't have to get creative in the sense of the core thing. The core thing is the.
Well, I think, I don't know this for fact, but I think there are people in the Mormon church that don't understand some of those things so much higher up into the concept. I remember when one of my coworkers' daughters was getting married, and they are pretty high up in this hierarchy too of the church, yet they weren't allowed to attend their daughter's wedding at the temple over in the Tomball area because
They were high enough.
they weren't high enough. And so here it is, I'm like. I don't understand that concept. I don't know. So if you're not even at that level and you're at this level, do you understand what's happening in those higher levels? And that's concerning to me.
Wouldn't that be classified as pride? That we have to get way up there in order to be among the elite of the elite?
I think it comes from that, and it also, again, nothing new under the sun. That was the early Gnostic concept.
Right.
There's some special knowledge out
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
And eventually you will rise to the point that the special knowledge is
Scientology.
Scientology's that way. Pay us a couple of $100,000 and you can have all the special knowledge that you want. Again, yeah, we gotta go. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording so we can do prayer requests really quick. It was good to be here with you guys in person today.
Same here.
Oh,
Well, Donna,